Aloha, namaste. This is Alexis with Radha Home Yoga, and I'm here to talk about our new moon that is coming up Wednesday morning, the 2nd of March, and it's going to be at 7:34 a.m. here in Hawaii, which is 9:34 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But before we have this new moon, leading up to this new moon, there is a celebration called Mahashivratri, and Mahashivratri is the great night of Shiva. And this is actually beginning today, which is Monday, the 28th of February, here in the US. So I'm on Hawaii time, which is even earlier than Pacific time. We're a couple hours earlier. But throughout the US, the 28th is what begins the 14th Titi or lunar phase of the waning moon, moving to that new moon where the moon and sun come together in exact degrees. Every month we have this 14th phase, and every month we have a Shivaratri. Shiva is consciousness itself, and the name Shiva means the corpse. This, dubbing of the 14th Titi as Shivaratri has to do with our state of our mind. And every month, as the moon waxes, our mind grows in its fullness. It's more engaged in the world. We can see the reflection of the sun on the moon in a full moon, and that fullness is reflected in ourselves, in our mind, and our psyche. Every month, as the moon wanes to dark, our mind goes to a darker state. It goes to a more meditative state. Instead of seeing that reflection, that separation, we think of Shakti as the moon and Shiva as the sun, that separation of consciousness from the activity that activates us into all the different realities we see and experience. The new moon is when they're joined. And so the moon is essentially eclipsed. It's dark every month at this time. And so it's a time that's more conducive to being in that meditative state, to being in a state where we're focused more on our internal comings and goings, and ultimately trying to release the comings and have more things go out of our mind. We're trying to stabilize our mind, allowing ourselves to come into that consciousness where we realize our true identity, our true state. And there's obviously varying levels of this to which we might be available for. But if we don't have any meditation practice, or we don't have any practices that put us in a meditative state, because there's of course moving meditation, there's ways to get ourselves there that don't necessarily involve sitting and being quiet with our eyes closed, but ideally we can get there. Then we're going to feel more depression, more loss, because that engagement that we crave, that makes us more social, that has us, more involved in the different emotions we're feeling and everything around us, it is going to be less present. And so we have a more depressive state. We have a state that makes us feel closer to death, closer to the corpse, closer to not feeling a part of everything. And so if we don't use it as a blessing, then it can be a curse, right? If we don't access this time and use it as a time for really honoring our inner self and finding that connection to source, then it's going to be a time when we just feel maybe a little bit more sad or alone or unengaged, and we might not know why. And so that's one of the things I really appreciate about being able to follow a calendar that's based on the actual movements of the earth in connection to the other planetary bodies and the luminaries. When we just live our lives based on the Gregorian calendar, we're not paying any attention to these cycles and to what a true month is, right? A true month doesn't start on the first of the month. This particular month with March, we have the new moon starting on March 2nd, so it's pretty closely aligned. But that's not the case every month. And a true month is a new moon cycle that passes through a full moon cycle 2 weeks later. And wanes back to dark until the next new moon cycle, which starts off the next new moon. So it's not aligned with the Gregorian calendar. And when we align with these phases, we start to see things in our life a lot differently. Whether you're a female who, has a menstrual cycle that might also be linked to the moon. Traditionally, it always was. And if you're not on, birth control or hormones and not living with a lot of light pollution or a lot of toxicity in your body, likely your cycle still is connected to the moon. You either might bleed with the new moon or you might bleed with the full moon. So having this awareness for women can be very inherent, just because our bodies are affected by the waxing and waning of the moon. But regardless of your, whether or not you have that actual physical representation in your life, you can notice your mind, you can notice the way you feel, you can notice your energy levels every month and see them really starting to wane as the moon itself wanes. And this is true for everyone. So the celebration of Shivaratri is every month, but in this particular month, which is the Hindu month of Falguna, we have what's called Mahashivratri. And this is said to be the time when the Earth's tilt is such where when we are sitting with our spines erect all night long, so if we're sitting in that meditative seat and we've managed to access the part of us that can do that, we're going to be the most aligned, the most conducive to reaching those high states of meditation that we're ultimately aiming to reach. In the Vedic concept in all of the philosophy, whether we're talking about yoga, whether we're talking about Ayurveda, or whether we're talking about Jyotish, the goal is Sanatana Dharma. This is eternal truth. This is what we're trying to all achieve. We each have our own personal path there in this lifetime, but ultimately all of us have that same aim, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we practice towards that or not. And in that trying to achieve truth, there's various paths people take towards that. Many people take the path of worship or bhakti, devotion. It can be mantras and chanting and praying, perhaps to murtis, perhaps to statues, or even just rocks that have been infused with the power of a deity. There's, the more common Western knowledge is around asana and pranayam, and perhaps even meditation, and certainly diet and some of the Ayurvedic concepts might be more infiltrated into our Western world. What can we do to take care of our physical form? This has a lot to do with Shiva consciousness. Shiva is the one we are praying to when we practice austerities, when we practice tapasya, when we are allowing ourselves to do disciplined activities that might actually be hard for us, or that might take something from our sense of ease. So we might have to, limit ourselves in some way, or bind ourselves in some way, or create a hardship for ourselves in some way in order to achieve this goal. But in so doing that discipline, we're able to unattach ourselves from our form, whether it's, a yogi in the Himalayas who's standing on one foot for however long, or people who are fasting. This is a way that we can all show, show our sense of discipline and show that we can show up for ourselves in this way, is to refrain from eating on Shivaratri. In addition to staying awake, right? Those are austerities. Those are things we can do that regular people can do, other than, standing on one foot or walking on nails, or many of the much more intense austerities that people might practice if they're on a Baba path, if they're on a path towards being a sadhu, or renunciating life. So for regular people, fasting, chanting, staying up all night, and really working towards finding that place in yourself that is able to merge your mind and your consciousness, right? That is going to get us closer to realizing truth. if we wake up every day and the first thing we do is we turn on our phone and we're looking at all the different information, posts on Facebook or the news or emails or whatever it is that we see, that's going to be what starts our mind rolling, and all this information and all these different distorted thoughts and feelings and facts coming together with our dream state that we just came out of. That's going to be how we move forward in our day with whatever junk is kind of there. If we're able to sit ourselves down and do some kind of practices, we can help to clear some of that. And we call it vritti, some of this mind stuff, and be able to start each day in a fresh state. And likewise, we can start each fresh moon, each new moon cycle in that fresh state if we honor that Shivaratri period. And this particular one, as I said, is the biggest Shivaratri of the whole year. And when I was traveling in India, I actually was fortunate enough to be there at this time in Haridwar, so right where the Kumbh Mela was happening, where there's a big celebration, where people from all over India come, pilgrims come from all the different places, and they flock to these places. And they're specific for places that have the mana, the power of, you know, these deities. You know, they have this energy that is so powerful. It's usually where there's a confluence of rivers, and there's the one in Haridwar, and there's one in Prayag, which I think is actually the primary place. And Prayag actually means the confluence of the two rivers. And then there's this one in Haridwar that I was at, and it was the most amount of people I've ever seen in my life, right? I actually saw it growing. I saw it growing up to Shivaratri when it was, you know, early, maybe February, maybe even a little bit of the end of January. There was kind of people coming, you know, and you could see the militaristic presence at the like train station in Haridwar and all around there. And I was actually staying in Rishikesh, which is just right outside of Haridwar. And I'd walk the bridge every day from Lakshman Jula, which is right above, into the town proper of Rishikesh, and see my teacher and practice. And it was no problem, you know, to live sort of higher up on the hill and walk through every day. And then I went up into the Himalayas for about a month and came back down right when it was really booming. So it was at this point, it was after my birthday, which is March 16th. So it was, you know, a little bit after that, but at that year, for that year, it was Shivaratri was after this date. And that's the biggest day, you know, that's when the most amount of pilgrims come to this place. And I decided with a friend of mine, even though I was very, very new to all of these teachings, I decided with a friend of mine to walk to the place in Haridwar. And it was, you know, probably like 7 miles. It wasn't an insane amount of time, but it was very hard to get on a bus or a train because there was so many people, so many people. And the buses had people hanging off of them. There were, you know, young boys sitting on the buses or hanging off of the doors. It was just quite honestly easier to walk. So we started walking, and we walked this whole pilgrimage. It was so many hours. We picked up a Japanese kid along the way who didn't speak any English, but he joined us for our journey. And my friend was actually Austrian, but he spoke, you know, quite good English. So we were able to talk. We get all the way there. And I mean, we got there very early because we had walked. So we didn't take one of the planned buses. We got there at maybe 3 a.m. And there was these long lines that were like barbed wire cattle pens is what it felt like. I mean, it felt like just these long lines that just went forever, you know, as if you're going to a concert where they have that, you know, the cones and the tape kind of weaving you, but instead of cones and tape, it was just barbed wire, and it went forever. I mean, it just went for so long. And so we, you know, line up in that, and we're trying to get through, but you don't want to walk that much when there's not many people there yet. Like we, you know, we were there very early for this morning prayer in the Ganges. So we kind of climbed through the the barbed wire instead. We went in through, and I still actually have a little tear on my lungi that I was wearing at the time. And we climbed all the way through, and we get out into the thing, and we, say our prayers, and we have our moment there, and we're preparing to leave just as the crowds are really starting to get full. And that same thing we had raced through was now full of people. And we have to cross over this bridge, and it's, you can see the big statue of Shiva right behind it. We're crossing over the bridge, but again, it's just so many people. Growing up in the Western world, and I didn't even grow up in a particularly crowded city. I grew up in Los Angeles and Atlanta, where there's a lot of space. There's not even all the subways and high buildings that most of us live in. Most of us lived in houses that had space between them. And to just have this many people around me was just actually overwhelming. And I'd been walking for miles, and we hadn't eaten very much. And so I said to my friend, I said, I have to sit down for a minute. We're like on this bridge with just so many people. And I sit down on the bridge, and he sits down next to me, and the Japanese kid sits next to him. And I turn to my left, and the man next to me is dead. There's a man next to me, and he's dead. He's been trampled or something. I don't know what happened. And I'm like, I turned to my friend, I'm like, this guy is dead. What do we do? And of course, my mind is like in this mindset of like, do we find his family? Like, do we tell a police officer? Like, what do you do? There's so many people. It's not like you can just go find, a police station or something. It's just a sea of people all around us. And as I'm bringing this up to my friend and thinking, I see people stopping, and they just start throwing rupees on his body. And I'm like, what is going on? And somebody finally told me they know how much money it costs to have a body burned, to have the ceremony that all Hindus want to have when they die. And so they're throwing rupees to help pay for the wood to cremate him, for him to go into the, and to have his burning. And it's not relevant, to go find his family and do all this other stuff. Wasn't what they were thinking of in that moment. They were just honestly happy for him. Like, here's this pilgrim who came all the way to Hardwar for Kumbh Mela, and made it to Shivaratri, and made it to the Ganges. And now he's, getting, this is like the way to go. This is the way to die. So it really changed my perspective about death, and about how we view death and our attachments to our life, and even to our form, our dead body form that we have. I grew up in a family that was Catholic. Open casket funerals are the norm, where even if someone was perhaps in an accident or had a particularly gruesome death, they would often do things to the body to make it somewhat presentable, and then still have the open casket that you could see. And I remember seeing my grandmother and she just looked so different. And it was quite creepy, actually, to see her like that. And when I think about the idea of, preserving the body or embalming the body or doing what we can to make it, and that attachment to the life itself, to the form, compared to the idea of burning the body, burning the form, and having our goal be to have completed certain spiritual things before we pass, as opposed to accruing certain material possessions, or whatever, other goals we might all have. And not to say that plenty of Indians don't also have those more materialistic goals, and that there aren't plenty of people who are spiritual enough to accept death in the Western world. But culturally, we have a very different approach to death, and this was profound for me to experience that. And I'm going to share my screen so I can talk about the actual new moon here, but I wanted to share that one story. And actually, it's funny because I had a dog that we had to put to sleep many years ago, and we had two dogs. There was one little one and the older one that had to be put to sleep. And I'll never forget her sitting right next to him the whole time the vet was there, just really curled up next to him, because the vet came to our house. And the minute his life left his body, the little dog left the big dog. It was like she just knew life was no longer in that form and walked away from it. She had been whimpering and whining and snuggling up next to him and cuddling him and licking him and all this stuff. And it was like, she just walked away. She's like, oh, he's not there anymore, and walked away. So, you know, I've had a few moments where I've seen that. I've seen the essence of what death is, and the body that's left behind is not the it's not animated anymore, right? It's and that's really what we're trying to learn through our meditative process, through this practice of yoga, of the asana, of the pranayama, of the meditation steps. Each one of those things is moving us closer to a state where we can detach from our body. And ultimately, you know, what makes somebody realized is that capacity to let go of even their form without it being taken. And there's a big difference between something being taken and something being let go, something allowed to release. So this is a big part of what we're learning here, and especially on this particular celebration. So you can see here we have quite a lot of planets all in two places. And these two places are Saturn's two signs. This is Capricorn, where we have Mercury, Saturn, Mars, and Venus. Mars and Venus just moved in the last couple of days. They've been tightly conjunct, you know, within a degree since Valentine's Day. And that's going to continue into March. So about March 16th, we're going to have them super close. So they cross the bridge into Capricorn together. And then we've had the sun, you know, moved past Saturn. Saturn was conjunct, and now the sun is moving into conjunction with Jupiter, and of course the moon for the new moon, because we already decided the sun and moon coming together is the new moon. So we have this conjunction, Jupiter, sun, and then Saturn is now has Mercury on it. Mercury is just barely off of Saturn here at the time of this new moon. So a lot of conjunctions, Venus, Mars, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, and Moon at the moment. And they're all in Saturn's two signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. So Saturn, who's Saturn and why do we have so much energy here? Saturn is the planet of time, right? Saturn is where we experience time. And that is a sobering thing to realize. It is that awareness of a future, and what are we but worried about our future, right? We have fear of our future. Of course, we also have hopes and dreams and things like that for our future, which Jupiter might bring us. But we have a tendency to reflect on what can go wrong in the future, and that brings us fear. We also have the past, right? Where we have a lot of regret, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering because of the things we've experienced from before. Now, we also have fond memories and all of this, but there's quite a lot of science around the fact that we have a stronger memory for negative things than positive things. So we might have those negative incidences really pop in our mind, whereas the many, many, you know, more pleasant experiences we had in our lives might not be as much to the front of our brain at all times. It's also pressure, right? When we have an awareness of time, we have an awareness of how limited that time is, that there's only this much time, and there's only this much time to, you know, complete the task you're currently working on before you have to get somewhere or get to that next meeting or that next appointment. There's only so much time before your next birthday, or, you know, whatever it is you wanted to accomplish in this year, in this period of time that you've dubbed a year, whether it be from your birthday or whether it be from January 1st, or whether it be based on a seasonal shift or a new moon cycle. There might be only so much time left in your life, right? And there's only so much time left in the people around our lives. And what do we want to do with that time? And more importantly, what do we have to do in that time? What has to be done or we'll die? Or has to be done before we die so that other people who we're leaving behind are taken care of? There's a lot of have-tos in Saturn's world. and a lot of pressure to take care of these have-tos, and a lot of fear that we won't, or if we don't, or we do and something bad happens anyway. There's a lot of awareness of the harsh realities of life here. Yet, this is also the planet that can help us find that freedom from our form, from our everything, from all that stuff we're worried about. Because what Saturn teaches us is, hey, you know what? You're totally right. That could happen. And maybe it will. And often it does. And yet, here you are, making it through, dealing with it anyway, dealing with whatever physical pain or illness or suffering or surgery you've had to have, dealing with whatever aging is bringing your way, dealing with whatever aging is bringing your parents' way or anyone around you's way. Here we are anyway. The worst has happened and still here you are. And if the absolute worst happens, which is you die, your body is the only thing that's dying. And this is Saturn's ultimate lesson for us, our ultimate teacher. So what a blessing on this time and this Shivaratri that we will have this many planets in Saturn's placement, because he helps bring us to a state where we meditate, because otherwise it's too painful, right? Otherwise it's too much. If we can't start to release some of our attachments, we can't handle the suffering. We can't handle the humbling experience that Saturn gives us over time, right? Saturn presses us out over time. Lots of long experiences, painful, drawn out. That's how we experience Saturn energy. And that's why his transits are so long, right? They're 2.5 years that he stays somewhere. And we've all been experiencing this with Saturn in Capricorn since January of 2020. It's that long haul, oh, this isn't going to be over. Nope, it's still going, and that's how we start to detach from our biggest fears. They're going to happen anyway. They're the biggest fear you've ever had. It's going to happen. That's what Saturn tells us. Good chance it will. Good chance it will. And you could sit there worrying about it, or you can start to detach yourself from that outcome, that that fear, the feeling of fear, and the attachment we have to a different outcome, which is really what gives us that fear. God forbid this happens, right? Because we really want this to happen. So this is a good time for really learning the sobering truths of life, for really accepting what is, and then finding a way to move beyond it. Even time, right? We have to accept that we're working with this clock and that there's a certain amount of time. But if we didn't have clocks and we didn't all try to schedule things and make appointments with each other, and we just lived our life in a daily rhythm that was based maybe on the sun and how the light allowed us to do things, we would probably have a relatively flowing schedule of events similar to how we have them when they're all mapped out and planned out, except for there wouldn't be all that stress about time, right? We wouldn't be like, okay, 5 minutes, okay, 10 minutes, okay, this amount of time, before I have to get to the next event. There wouldn't be all those lost minutes spent just worrying about the time itself, just worried about it running out. So I'm going to talk about each of these little conjunctions here for a moment. We have, like I said, Jupiter and the sun and moon very close at this point. Jupiter is actually in a different nakshatra. He just moved into Purva Bhadrapada, which is his own nakshatra, but we have the sun and moon new in Satabhishak. And Satabhishak is the part of Aquarius where we become heightened awareness of that which is not right in society, that which is not okay. This is a star of, rebels or revolutionaries. Satabhishak is ruled by Varuna, and Varuna is often called, the god of the ocean or the god of the waters. People will refer to him that way. But in essence, Varuna is actually the dark sun. He's the sun that goes beneath the ocean at night, underneath the horizon. And as such, his eyes are all the stars in the night sky, and they see what's going on. They see the corruption. They see the unfairness. And there's this quality of sort of punishing that comes here, where we want to punish those who are corrupt, those who are using their power in corrupt ways. So there's a quality of the underbelly of society here. And of course, Aquarius is right across from Leo, and Leo is the government. Leo is the king. Leo is the president, the rulers, the elite, the people who hold power, both from lineage and money. And, in our current way, it looks a little different how people get there, but those who have an inordinate amount of power. Now, if the king doesn't serve the people, and it's, Leo's 7th house is Aquarius. So it's literally even like your partner is the people when you're Leo, then the people revolt, right? The people get mad and they don't want to follow the king anymore. Ultimately, leadership is necessary. And I talked about this a lot last 2 weeks ago when we had our full moon in Leo. Leadership is important. It's fundamental. People follow leaders. Most people don't want to be a leader. Most people don't want to know. They don't want to be the ones making the driving decisions. Most people want other people to tell them, which is why people in power are able to keep it, right? But when the people in power are no longer serving the population that they're having power over, those people will often get fed up, especially if it gets to the point where their basic needs are no longer being met, and they'll revolt. And this star is particularly where we see that. We see what is not okay, and we're not going to put up with it anymore, right? That's what it comes to. There's a Rahuvian quality. The North Node Rahu rules Sattva. So we see this sort of quality of suspicion, of foreignness, otherworldliness. When Rahu is present, there's a feeling of being sort of out of place. And that quality can help us see what's weird or wrong in a society. When you're part of a collective, when you're part of a society, you take things for granted, oh, that's just how we do things. But if you've ever traveled to a foreign country, like my story that I told before, where I'm in India and I'm coming from a foreign perspective and I'm seeing how they're handling the situation with this person who died, and that it wasn't even, no one else was really shocked or surprised that there was a dead person on the bridge, but I was. And that was my culture coming in with my experience, and it looked different. And I was able to have a perspective on it that most of the other people there probably just take for granted. I didn't have a lot of thoughts around it. So Rahu gives us that perspective, gives us that chance to see things from a different way. But sometimes we're really wrong, right? I could have looked at it and been like, these are cold people throwing money on someone, or I could have looked at it in so many different ways if I didn't have a curious and open mind and enough to even be there to begin with, that I wanted to understand why people do things. But many people, especially we see this with Americans or people from English speaking countries, I notice, will travel to these countries and they won't ask questions and they won't ask why someone does something, and they just judge it as being really silly or outdated or wrong in some way compared to what they know. And Rahu can do that too, right? Rahu can judge things and make it think it's wrong without fully understanding it. And that quality brings, sometimes some powerful intuition. It also sometimes brings some delusion and some confusion. And so when we're seeing what's wrong, when we're seeing the corruption, we need to be aware that there's also an element that might not be exactly as we're seeing it, that we might not know all the backstory to everything that we see. And this is an important element when we're trying to create social change, because we get fired up and we want to change things, but we often don't know how. And oftentimes the people changing things or helping others are those who don't actually come from the world at all that is being shifted and changed. And so it is that outsider perspective that can offer help and a lift up perhaps, but doesn't necessarily understand why things are the way they are first. So that's an important quality when we're trying to create the future. And Aquarius has a lot of qualities of trying to create the future. And we're moving more and more into this period, because Saturn is going to actually dip into Aquarius come the end of April. And it's just going to be for a couple months before he moves back into Capricorn. His official, tenure in Aquarius isn't going to be until January of 2023, but we're going to feel that energy when he shifts into Aquarius of movement, of air, of the future, of how that's imagined through our mind, through the intellect. And Jupiter has already been here since November 20th of 2021. So we've gotten a lot of our beliefs and our ideals wound up in this place of how can it be different? What can we do differently? What are the systems that going forward that can be different? Aquarius also has a lot to do with technology. So a lot of the systems end up being technological. Again, we have to make sure we understand why things are the way they are before we make something new, because sometimes new is not better. So this is one of the growth edges of Aquarius, is wanting to set out the new frontier, but also making sure we understand the ramifications of new choices we make and why things were the way they were to begin with, the history of things, especially in a social context, especially when we take all the different cultures and countries that reside on this earth at this time. So as our sun, and moon are sitting here in this space right now, we're sort of at the apex of it, because as you can see, just a few degrees later, we move into Purva Bhadrapada. And Purva Bhadrapada is also really profound that Jupiter's there for Shivaratri, because Purva Bhadrapada is actually the lightning bolt of insight that we are more than this body, that we are not just this form, that we are much beyond that. So Jupiter and Purva Bhadrapada is aligning our wisdom and our capacity to expand into that wisdom with this early part of this notion that, hey, we're not even this body. This isn't even us. When this body dies, we continue. And that is the beginning of awakening, really. It's the beginning of the awakening that's available to us. So we also have Mercury and Saturn joined here together in Capricorn. And this is also a positive alignment for meditation, because when Saturn is really close to Mercury, sometimes we hold our words. We're not as quick to speak. So we're either slow to speak or even hesitant to speak, because Saturn is in such good dignity in his own sign, and even Mercury is in good dignity in Capricorn. We might be just more cautious in our speech, right? More careful with our wording. And slower, of course, is almost always better when we're trying to communicate, because if we're communicating really fast, not only does the other person not able to necessarily understand us, but that's when we usually slip or misspeak or say something in a way that isn't received well. And ultimately, when we're communicating, an important thing to remember is not just to stay true to words and speak in your highest capacity to speak, but to communicate in a way that the other people you're speaking to can understand what you're saying. That's like the most important part of communication, and we often forget it. It's why words were invented, right? So that we could talk to each other. So if you speak perfect English, but you're speaking to someone who speaks Spanish, it doesn't matter how much more perfect your English is. Right? That's the big joke about Americans when they travel, is that they start to just speak louder to somebody when they don't understand them. And I've actually witnessed that. I've actually traveled with a friend who did that. And I was like, wow, that's where that comes from. That we have this concept that everyone, speaks the same way as we do. And if we're more clear and more loud, then someone will understand us. But if they don't speak that language, they won't understand us. And so the more we can humble ourselves, Saturn, in Capricorn Shrudra cast, where we're not talking about the most educated language we can use, but we're talking about the common language in which someone can actually get what we're saying. And we think about the fact that we're in this place where our relationships have been very tender. And I've been talking about this a lot, so I'm going to talk just a little bit more about it at the very end with the Mars and Venus conjunction. We've had a lot of, connection concerns as Mars is really trying to individuate and Venus is really trying to relate, and there's some conflict there. we can imagine that it becomes super important to stay in that humility, to stay in that truth of what we are trying to say, but without all the projections, right? Saturn offers us, again, that just cold, harsh truth, that cold, harsh reality, where we don't get to just play sort of a blame game or, projecting or judgments or all this other stuff, where we can really just stay in the humility of how we're experiencing whatever we're experiencing, whether it's, just sadness or anger or feeling downtrodden, whatever the different experiences are, we can just simply say them. And we don't need to create a whole story around it in order to make that valid. We're allowed to feel sad, for example, without having even a reason. We don't actually need to have a whole story around why we feel sad. We might have one, and we often do, but we don't need to share it in such a way where we're telling the other person that they're the ones who's caused that for us. We can own our emotions and own the fact that they are ours, and that not everyone in that exact same position would feel the same way as us. And we can also own the fact that what we do and why we do it is different than why other people do what they do, not just on a cultural level, as I was talking about before, but on an interpersonal level. So if we hold for a moment when we feel upset by something someone's done, and instead of assuming that person did it for the same reason that we did it, which would mean basically that we were, whatever that tells us, that they're dismissing us or being mean to us or cutting us off or whatever the story is, that would mean if we did those same actions, perhaps for them there's a totally different reason why they've done that, and it doesn't indicate any of those same things that it would have indicated for us. So this is where slow communication, humble communication, being open to hearing what somebody else has to say is really important. Now, Saturn isn't necessarily open. Saturn is, again, fearful. There's that quality of fear. But because he's in his own sign, that fear over time is teaching us, and it's been some time now, he's been here for 2 years. So we've learned a lot, and we've learned that somebody might be saying the worst possible thing, just like the worst possible thing might actually be what's going to happen. The worst thing we can imagine might be what happens. And yet it's not still that bad, right? At the end of the day, the worst is not that bad, because if the absolute worst is death, and death is just us resigning this particular, outfit that we're donning in this lifetime, then nothing else can be that bad either, right? It's all a matter of our acceptance of it. And again, Saturn, and I've talked about this a lot, but I'm going to say it again because of course we live in tense times right now and people want to jump out at anything that's being said. Saturn's energy is not meant to use on other people, right? So I'm not talking about bypassing other people's experience and saying, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal, that you're sick or you lost your leg, get over it. I'm talking about for ourselves. With others, we use Venus, we use Mercury, we share compassion, we share communication, we honor each other. But with ourselves, we start to detach from the emotions we feel. We start to detach from all our very many attachments we have. It's a very different experience than when you're doing it to someone else. Very different. Mars, similar. We have to use the Mars energy on ourselves. We're disciplining ourselves. We're strengthening ourselves. We're creating courage and activity for ourselves. We're not doing that to other people. And we're not blaming them for our own lack of discipline. And that's really what Mars and Venus together have been teaching us. And now that they're in Capricorn, we can expect to see a little bit more intelligence running with this. While Mars was in really good dignity in Sagittarius, there was a lot of capacity to perhaps have discipline towards your spiritual practices or towards, what you believe. Venus is not in as good of dignity in Sagittarius. Venus really is where we spiritually bypass people and ourselves, where we override everything with some philosophy or some idea. And we, really operate best with people who have the same beliefs as us, so that they don't get offended when we spiritually bypass them, right? So that they can actually, they're like, oh yeah, that's my belief too. Okay, let's override our emotions and feelings and experiences together to attach to this concept. Whereas the concept itself exists, the truth exists. independent of our experiences, right? Independent of whether we believe it. But we still have to get there. So whatever our human experiences are that we're having, we need to get there. And just being told that philosophy doesn't get us there. There have to be steps to get there. And often very spiritual or very religious people miss that step. They miss that part between Venus and Jupiter, where we're taking our beliefs and using them in practical ways that are actually honoring each other, as opposed to just saying these beliefs as if they're true and expecting you to get over your human experience to get there. This is a big disconnect in a lot of spiritual teachers and teachings, but really not the teachings. The teachings aren't the problem, right? The teachings are okay. They're beautiful. They're true. They're right. It's the teacher who's supposed to help the student experience that, how to get there, not just say, get there. And this is really the shortcoming that I see the most in spiritual communities and in spiritual teachers specifically. And of course, there's a long history of it with the organized religions, you know, with the organized, powerful religions. It's part of the essence, actually. So this Mars-Venus conjunction has been teaching us a lot about ourselves and each other. And now that Mars is in Capricorn, where it's exalted, we have an opportunity to really direct that discipline and direct that energy that could turn to anger and put it into a concrete, physical, earthbound project that is survival based, you know, like Capricorn. It's going to try to keep us alive. It's going to be related to our most basic necessities. And the action goes somewhere, and it really takes away that part of Mars energy that flies off the handle, that gets angry, that gets upset, because it has a channel, it has a path, it has somewhere to go. So this is a blessing. It gives us a chance to really strengthen that Mars energy, but in a humble way and doing something towards something. And when we're working towards a goal, that's going to probably help our relationships too. First of all, we're showing up for ourselves, so we're in a better state in order to meet other people. Second of all, if we're productive, you know, if we're not just doing our practices, our spiritual practices, but we're actually productive in the world, that's generally helpful to relationships. Most relationships are not just about a spiritual connection or a physical connection. There's also a partnership element involved where we need to take care of our stuff and we're helping each other do that. So having Mars be in a productive vein can be helpful, even if it's not spending time with your partner, that you're doing something that's going to help both of us. Ideally, if you're in a relationship or even a business partnership, that can be very helpful. Venus is also in good dignity in Capricorn, whereas she was not in Sagittarius. So here in Capricorn, we do have that practical, grounded capacity to give and take and have an understanding or humility and really just awareness and acceptance of what is possible. Our standards are lower. We're not thinking things have to be so high. We're not in this sort of Leo world where we want to be put on a throne and gilded with diamonds. We're just happy if somebody's building a house, or we're just happy if somebody's, you know, taking care of the most fundamental basic things they need to take care of. So our relationship goals become a lot more doable, and we become a lot more accepting of people's flaws as we ourselves experience our own flaws. So there's a lot to work with Venus and Capricorn. Sometimes Venus and Capricorn can be a bit utilitarian. All the planets in Capricorn operate this way, where they're using somebody for its function, just like they use everything else for its function. It's a survival sign. It's a sign where we're trying to survive. And when we're trying to survive, you know, if your diamond ring is going to be the reflector we need in order to, you know, make it on the ship out at sea, then that's what we're going to use that for. You know, everything becomes useful, including humans, including people, including each other. But again, there's that acceptance of that. Saturn is a friendly sign to Venus. They're friendly to one another, excuse me, the planets. So we are accepting of the fact that someone else has needs and that we're filling them in some way. Again, that part of partnership where we're actually trying to accomplish things and live our life becomes really high, front and center in Capricorn. And so we are okay with that. So overall, this is a period of time where we have a lot of kind of tensions of some opposites or planets that are more friendly, like Mercury and Saturn are friendly, Jupiter and the Sun are friendly, Mars and Venus are still that opposing energy, but there's a lot more intelligence running here with them in this moment. And the sobering quality of Saturn is really going to help us accept, slow down, and hopefully move in the direction of expanding time, moving past time, the concept of time as we have it, where we think of it as so limited, just like our resources, just like our relational capacity. We have this limited perspective, and Saturn really puts the limits on us. Like, it puts so many limits on it. It puts so much pressure on us. It puts so much of the potential of disaster on us that we actually begin to move past it, because at some point it's a breaking point, right? It's like at some point you're it's so hard you just can't do it, right? Or it's so there's no money, so what, you can't do anything about it, or there's so much physical health problems that you have to surrender. Like, there's a point we all reach with various aspects of our life, and usually with Saturn can have to do with money, poverty, things like that, or old age, aging, and health, that kind of thing, or disabilities and stuff like this. And that labor class, or that those people who work very hard with their hands in the in the mines, in the fields, those who have to work in physically arduous and oftentimes dangerous positions. These are kind of the worlds that Saturn rules over. But ultimately, he's the great meditator. Ultimately, he's the one who actually can take us to Shiva consciousness, not because we're aiming towards the sun and aiming towards the light, but because we've seen so much of what is not good or not light. The darkness has shown itself to us in so many ways that we start to recognize that the dark and the light are the same on some level, and that our attachment to things is what's causing us the pain and the suffering. And each thing that we're able to step back from, or have less attachment to, or less attachment to the results of whatever action we're taking, the more we're able to move into that state of peace, which is ultimately what we want to experience. And so finally, I'm going to end this here because I know this has been long, but we have the two nodes are still forming this Kala Sarpa Yoga here, and they're about to move March 17th, March 16th and 17th. They're going to be moving into Aries and Libra axis. And I'm going to do a whole report on this for all 12 signs. If you're not already on my email list, you can sign up for that. And when it's ready, it will send directly to you, where I go through what this nodal switch will mean for each of the 12 rising signs. As it sets up the houses, the rising sign really shows what area of your life is going to be activated in any given cycle. But because right now all the planets are still between these two, we have what's called the Kala Sarpa Yoga, or time snake. And so while we have all this energy in this sort of Saturnian way, we also have this heavy nodal energy that is enclosing all the planets. So rather than it just being a node joined with one particular planet, or the sun and moon in an eclipse, it's like squeezing all the planets in between them. And it creates this otherworldly quality to our experience for half the month. The other half of the month, the moon will be outside of these. And so it won't technically be a Kala Sarpa Yoga, because our mind, our moon, will be out of it. But as right now is the moon is in it too. And so we have this quality of perhaps very, very strong and powerful messages or insights we can receive if we do meditate, if we do the work to really get ourselves into a state of clarity. It's very possible. We also have a lot of potential for delusion and illusion, especially the more we're just engaging in the world, the more we're getting captivated by the mind stuff of the world, the headlines, the social media chatter, the gossip in our little circles or worlds or at your work or whatever the drama is around you, the more you get caught up in that, the more the delusion becomes powerful. The more you're clearing your mind, the more you're moving away from that and allowing yourself to lose some of that stimulation, the more you're able to get the powerful insights. So it's really important to be aware of how you're spending your energy and what you're directing your mind towards, because that will be exacerbated from the Rahu end and pinpointed and sort of, um, found as a point of disgust on the south end. And it's really the north end moves, the nodes move backwards. So it's really the north node moving that towards the south node. And since it's the very end of the transit, the very end of this transit of Rahu and Taurus, Ketu and Scorpio, we can feel where it's trying to complete this cycle. It won't be back for 18 years here. So it's trying to complete this cycle. And Taurus is our values, our security, our connection to the earth, the land, food, and pleasure. We want those things. We want security. We want food. We want to feel good. We want sensual pleasure. And we want to experience harmony and peace. And what's keeping us from that are those pesky shadows in Scorpio, or those, trauma and our fears, imagined and real, and all this stuff and all of our emotions and the turmoil that's keeping us from that peace. So and of course, for each of us, it's different houses. So that's going to be a significant part in what it's doing to you, particularly what house it's coming from. But that squeeze, that time snake that we're in, that's coiling around you, is helping you complete that karma, to clear those pieces of drama and trauma that keep you from your peace and security. And so again, powerful time to really sit with yourself and to find more time away from all the stimulation. So yes, we have, families and jobs and places that we go and social things. And many people are very excited to even be able to be social at this point in time. I know in my world, there's a lot of people who have, birthdays, including my own, and all these kind of people who, all kinds of celebrations or gatherings or things that are happening right now. And so it can be hard to pull back. It can be hard to pull away, especially when we've been feeling all that disconnect from the Mars Venus. We're wanting to find connection somewhere, where we can, but it becomes increasingly important to take the time, so choose wisely where you spend your time, choose wisely where you spend your energy, especially today and tomorrow. And the next day, even as the new moon begins, really, really allowing that to be some downtime for your mind. And I hope that's helpful. I'm going to close with a mantra to Shiva. This is one I was taught, and I was taught actually very early on in my yogic practices. And I used it quite a bit when I was traveling throughout India afterwards, because I went up into the Himalayas, and there was like very rickety buses that would whirl around on the edge of these mountains, and it was pretty terrifying actually to be in those buses. And I just remember repeating this mantra again and again and again. And it's said to be a mantra of protection. And, of course, in the concept of Shiva, if we go back to that Shiva consciousness that we are ultimately trying to access here right now, we're not trying to protect ourselves from death, right? We're trying to protect ourselves from the idea of death and move beyond it to that state of immortality that we all actually have. It's not something the gods have or something that, that these mythological characters have. It's something that we all have. It's just a matter of understanding that it doesn't take place in this same, outfit that we're donning for this lifetime. just as this same outfit doesn't look the same as it did when you were a kid or when you were a baby. And it doesn't look the same now as it's going to look when you're older, unless you're already older. And then you know that. Then you know it didn't look the same when you were in your 30s and 40s, you know, and it's it's just that, right? It's our suit. And so when we're able to move beyond that, then we find our own chance at immortality. We find our own opportunity for that. But nonetheless, I have used it as a protection mantra many times when I'm worried about this actual form and this outfit getting hurt. And it's a very powerful and well-known mantra. So if you know it, feel free to chant along with me. The Maha Mrityunjaya mantra. Let's stop. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandim Pushti Vardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanam Mrityor Mokshya Mamritat Sajang Om. And many blessings on your Mahashivratri and new moon. Namaste.